Good morning. Today we are going to continue what we have done in the previous lecture, that is in the fourth semester, fourth lecture. In the fourth lecture, we discussed about the social welfare function, especially with a special reference to the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. But as a continuation of that, because we need to really think about the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics and its implication. As a continuation of that, let me move a couple of other concepts also, which is part of the first fundamental theorem, which will lead us to move to the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So, what are these things? So, the first point is in that line is uh, theory of second best. Okay. Now, what is why should we study or talk about the theory of second best? Is because uh, the first fundamental theorem, we know that if there is a competitive equilibrium, the Pareto efficient allocation should be Pareto efficient. That is a kind of a positive statement in that sense. But unfortunately, that means all the markets, given the fact that when we speak about general equilibrium, this is also talks about all the market, all the money market, product market, then fact market, all markets. Everything is actually going to be in equilibrium. None of the market is being distorted. But there are instances which you can see that there is also distortion in the market. We have already encountered many real world incidents which do have concerns on this aspect. So the distortion in one market lowers, in fact, the efficiency in the other market. That is the competitive equilibrium will be distorted in that sense. So further distortions may increase or decrease the efficiency in a further accelerating rate, or what you call there is a possibility of running back and again running back and back kind of a situation, or I run because you run and you run because of I run kind of a logic in that sense. So you have all possibility of basically reduce your equilibrium if one market encounters a kind of distortion. That's so the first fundamental there therefore has a little power for real world policy analysis in that sense. That's what it has been often pointed to, the fact that the application or the real world application of the first fundamental theorem, first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, is often been suspiciously questioned. But I had in the previous lecture told that this is not actually to make a policy, but it is actually create a kind of a benchmark to have policy. So both perspective is different in that sense. So the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, sorry, there is a typo, it is not normative, it's positive, but the normative concepts, what ought to be, how we can actually change, etc., can be discussed further. So by identifying an ideal market structure provides basis for general policy direction and designs market to maximize participation and information in that sense. So effective incremental progress towards the goal is unclear often, and this is what is actually we said already, the relevance of the second best. That is, suppose if there is a distortion happens, then that is going to affect the competitive equilibrium as well as the efficient allocation of resources in that line. So if all markets are perfectly competitive, role of government uh, still exist. That is what is actually for may exist. But technically speaking, we have seen that in a stricter sense, there is no point of having a government if you have a competitive equilibrium and an efficient Pareto allocation happens. That is, if the world of first fundamental theorem of welfare economics strictly say that there is no point of actually having, or people are indifferent between whether there is a government or not. But this indifference is actually not that indifferent, because in real world, if there is a government exists, then that itself incur a lot of cost in that sense. So it is actually not so wise to say that this increment, the existence of government create a kind of indifference among individual. So that is also that is also been dismissed in that context. So although the perfect the Pareto efficient situation, the competitive equilibrium allocation may be socially undesirable or morally unfair in that sense. So this is also quite clear because I said in the beginning that when we talk about the Edgeworth box diagram and to the efficiency principles which we discussed, yeah, that is least concerned about the distribution. How much one person received to that of the other. So the distributive justice portion we haven't actually discussed very well. Whereas this question remains very pertinent, especially the morality of having one person 99 and the other 1%. In an efficiency point of view, it is actually efficient because you have only 100 rupee and that is shared between 99 and 1, but still it is efficient because you have expended or spent all the 100 rupees with you to two individual. But the question of fairness comes there. That is also very important, and that is why I said many people argue that even if you have a Pareto efficient situation and a competitive environment, the morality questions, the moral questions are also very, very important. And this is nothing to do with, your theorem, nothing to do with that. So your theorem in that sense is not plausible anyway. This is a kind of a criticism which leveled against first fundamental theorem of welfare economics by many. So in that context, even we need to really think about the distributive justice matters, a kind of a debate. There comes the example which I would like to say. See, suppose if you have actually 100 rupees and that 100 rupees being distributed among two, see, then you may be having actually two indifference which tangentiate based on the exhaustion principle. But at the same time, suppose one individual, in order to sustain or live, the person is having only 1 rupee entitlement, which makes the person literally existing. All right, because he or she cannot live with that paltry amount. If that is, suppose if that is the kind of situation, then you probably may have a kind of distribution which makes minimum necessities. So the distribution should be minimum of this kind. Say a person's this life supporting income probably is actually 15 rupees or 20 rupees. Then what the government or the kind of situation has to do is actually there is a merge for reallocation of the resources. But still, from the efficiency point of view, still it holds Pareto efficiency we can retain. How we can do it? Actually, you take the other person's life standard can also be actually retained with 30 rupees or 40 rupees or 50 rupees. But anyway, this person's minimum life support is actually 50 rupees. So then you make a point that your distribution, you're not talking about actually the complete redistribution and making the other person completely worse off, but at least you should ensure a kind of a distribution which is fairer from the existential point of view at least. So in that sense, so a redistribution from 99 to in fact 50 will not only improve the other person utility, but your total utility remains same if the same principle of the Paretian kind if we try to inculcate. Then at the same time the other person also get benefited because of this thing, right? Because that is also very, very important. Other person benefit in the sense that the person who has more distribution is losing only a small portion of money in absolute, but his sustenance or his wellness is not actually curtailed so much. But at the same time, the utility which the other person gains is actually life sustenance. So that have a higher utility in that sense than the other thing. Of course, Technically, many people will argue that, very clinical way of putting it as that it is not a feasible one or kind of that. But that is not actually a kind of economics which we really need to deal with. So in that perspective, then there is a possibility of a redistribution. That possibility of redistribution improves the sort of indifference curve of the least advantaged person, and the most advantageous person's indifference curve, the marginal utility is actually, shrinks very marginally in that sense. So in that sense, you can simply say that the redistribution in fact make the total utility to a higher level. Although from the efficiency point of view, this is nothing to do, but this redistribution is actually makes a kind of a moral justification in that sense. So it can be a fairer kind of a redistribution also. Now there comes actually the importance of the government, like the implementation of different allocation policies, like tax, then reallocation of different kind. Tax is one method. Then you can also actually charge very high consumption, whatever toll, then quota, then you can actually fix a lot of things in order to create a kind of inclusiveness within the same sort of pie, the distribution of the pie. So in that sense, you can also retain your kind of distribution, your kind of efficiency from the exhaustion point of view. At the same time, you can also ensure that there is a distributive justice achieved. So there comes actually the importance of the government and income tax system and other welfare programs. Everything do rationalized on. I mean, it get its own rationalization only in this ground. That is very very important. And does the theory suggest how this should be done? Again, the redistribution using price result in inefficiency kind of argument is already in place, but that is actually not so much advisable from the perspective in that sense. So these are actually the real concerns one has to really talk about. Many people have actually dilly-dally positions in this. But I think we need to really talk about all these things. Even in the classrooms, text discussions, every time we need to really discuss that what kind of policy we really need. All right, and typically this is itself revolutionizes the teaching and learning process of economics. See, simply going by some X said theorems are not actually going to make anybody better off in that sense. So there comes the redistributive aspect of welfare and redistributive aspect of making a system better kind of system. This will lead to the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. And I have already mentioned that what is actually the second fundamental theorem of welfare. The redistribution and has to create a kind of competitive environment or an efficiency environment in that sense. So if that is the case, then you can say that this is a second fundamental theorem. It gives way to the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So let us look into the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. That is, this is SFTW is nothing but the economics in the Joet box diagram, if you look into, and it strictly talks about the convexity assumptions. Now, for the first one, it has nothing to do with the convexity or anything. All right, any distribution, any given distribution is efficient under the kind of what you call the Edgeworth box diagram. That's what we have already seen. The distribution of 1 versus 99 or 50-50 makes no difference in that sense of efficiency. All right, that is what is actually something we have talked about under the first fundamental theorem, which is in my mind not a perversive point. Actually, what I feel is actually it's kind of a benchmark where everybody has to aspire to, right? No, we shouldn't actually teach that this is the situation, but what I feel is that we need to achieve that kind of situation uh, in that particular perspective, you just convert your first fundamental theorem of and its positivity into the normativity, or what you say that our aspiration is towards to create first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Then it becomes naturally the normative constant than the positive one. So with this, let me go to the details of the second fundamental theorem. Now, if you have a desired Pareto optimal allocation can be achieved by the appropriate redistribution of wealth in a lump sum fashion and then letting the market work, then it means that some Pareto optimal allocation may not be competitive equilibrium unless we transfer the wealth. That is what is actually probably it means. That is, the Pareto optimal allocation is supportable as an equilibrium with a transfer in that sense. So let us look into the details of it, how we can basically understand this whole process. So suppose if you have an allocation X star in the Edgeworth box diagram is equilibrium with a transfer. If there is a price system P star and a wealth transfer T1 and a T2 satisfies T1 plus T2, which is equal to 0, that is the planner runs a balanced budget. That is the T1 and T2 is going to be equated, balanced. Okay, expenditure and income is being whatever equated, only redistributive wealth between the consumer, such that for each consumer I we have a utility of X star which is greater than the utility of X dash for all X dash, such that P star X dash I is less than P star WI plus T1 CTI. Sorry. So this is what is actually the standard narration which we may be having in that sense. Okay, so once you have all that, then we can move into the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which talks that every Pareto efficient allocation can be implemented as a competitive equilibrium for some initial endowment of resources. Suppose Pareto efficient allocation is A dash is preferred to the Pareto to the present competitive equilibrium allocation A, which I'll come to come with a diagram very soon. Then there exists some allocation B such that if the government allocates endowment from A to B, which is A to B, and that this competitive market can implement the desired Pareto efficient allocation of A dash. But if A is actually given to B or A then B possible, then why both with a market reallocation directly from A to A dash, that is cost of government intervention, which is direct or indirect. So this is actually kind of an understanding of what we normally speak about as the second fundamental theorem. Let's look into the graph, then things will become more clear. Now this is actually, and now you have actually different kinds of distribution. Your social welfare function has been marked as the indifference curve in red, and you have a UPF utility possibility frontier, and in that you have different points A, B, C, D kind of thing. See, we maybe talked about the condition A. So see, the condition A itself is actually in the utility possibility frontier, right? Now once you have that in the utility possibility frontier, then you also has the same utility possibility frontier, which is actually an underutilization of that if you have a reallocation, that is to C. All right, if you move towards the point C, which is actually more beneficial for A and less beneficial for B. Just recall the example which I said. You have two individual A and B, and that A is having a higher entitlement, but this entitlement we consider only for a kind of a utility which is actually sustainable, sustenance utility in that sense. Now, if 1 rupee is not gives this person anything, so this the amount is maybe very small for the other person. Similarly, if you move the other point also, suppose if it is instead of A or C to that of another extreme point A dash, So if you have an A dash, which is I have not marked, but which is an intersection point of the AC indifference curve. All right. So if that is the case, then you may be having the issue of B. UA is, that is A is going to have the issue of B right now, because A may be having a lower distribution with that of the B. In the current case, B is having actually a lower utility than A, because maybe A is actually having too much of uh, uh, too much of the portion of the pie than B. So if you simply recall our example of 1 rupee versus 99, and the total distribution 100, from the efficiency point of view, it is actually efficient or Pareto efficient in that allocative mechanism. Now we can also counterintuitively talk about an issue, that is, suppose if it is based on the sustenance. As I said, you need at least 20 or 15 rupees for having a sustenance, life, to sustain your life. Then a redistribution from 99 to this guy, that is to 16 rupees or 15 rupees, that is actually in fact takes away some portion of his utility. All right. Now he is given that in the utility frontier, he can move towards a point in the middle, because his sustenance is already there, so he can actually move. But at the same time, the other individual's utilities actually shoots up, because with 1 rupee, he or she may not be actually living, or they can sustain their life. But now with the 15 rupees, they can sustain their life. So the utilities actually shoots up because of this redistribution. At the same time, the other person's sustenance also being ensured, but some portion of the money is being actually reduced from a distributive point of view. All right. Now others may be opposing it, but from a distribution point of view, or the welfare point of view, this is possible. Now this is what is actually all the reallocation do. Precisely, you don't actually change the whole sum, but what you do is actually you change the distribution in that sense. So now the distribution changed it to B, and that B is now gives you a better indifference curve. At the same time, A is already there in the UPF itself. That is the utility possibility frontier of his original one. Now the other person's in utility is increased. So under the Paretian sense, see, there is a possibility of potential improvement, though the distribution in a technical sense is actually efficient in the earlier case. Now in real terms, the both are actually being better off because of this thing. Or you can say that not at least not both are better off. One person got better off and the other's position is not got worse off. Why? See, the other person is in the UPF itself, and the other guy who is actually earlier at a lower indifference curve now moved towards a higher indifference curve in that sense. So society's most preferred allocation in that sense can be can be changed in this line. So it requires actually specifying social welfare functions and its objectivity, etc. So it is not a typical way of simply your utility and the original almond shape of, or the almond interaction, that is the point of interaction, that is gives a possibility of reallocation to the tangentiation line in that sense of the edge work, which we had discussed earlier. Excuse me. Excuse me. So that is we have already seen in the earlier discussion. But that is one way of actually looking at the same problem. So now we are dealing that with the utility frontier, and we say that the social welfare function is being in that sense maximized, and the walrus in sense you have a minimization, that is the poorest among the poor. If you make a redistribution in favor of the poorest among the poor, then definitely the society will be at a better position. This is a Walrasian welfare, Rawlsian, not Walrasian, the Rawlsian kind of social justice. This is what is actually Mahatma Gandhi in fact talked about. When you make a policy, you just think about actually somebody who's the least advantaged. So what does it mean? It is actually makes a kind of a social understanding. What is that social understanding? It talks about a very important lesson that being myself as a policy maker, or being actually the policy maker as a category or a class, I don't do a policy which is normally against me. All right, I want to always make a policy for bettering me, but at the same time, if I consider the poorest among the poor in that policy group and still make a policy, then I can assure that the poorest among the poor get improvement, will also makes I'll ensure that I also make myself improved in that kind of a situation. But otherwise also I can actually take the same kind of a privilege and make a policy, and that policy may improve myself only. Okay, that is that policy is highly individual, this particular policy class oriented only. So if that is the case, also you do the same policy, but at the same time, if you do the policy for the poorest among the poor, or the disadvantaged, or so-called the disadvantage in your segment, then that is definitely going to improve yourself also, at least in some way. So you may make yourself better off, but not a complete better off in the sense that an absolute takeover, but relatively you give the other as well as you make yourself better off. So this is actually gives a kind of a total welfare at a much different level altogether. Of course, this is what is called the Rawlsian social welfare function, or Gandhi's perspective of welfare in that sense. So I would see the parallel of Rawls and Gandhi often. So identify point of tangency between UPF and SWF in that context, especially very crucial in this particular diagram, because in this case and the previous lectures which I had made is in fact talked about this. That is, you have an A and a C, which is actually, if you redistribute from A to C, then you are actually at the same indifference curve. What happened is actually you got worse off. But if you redistribute to a kind of B, you made at least 1% got better off and still retain the other. So where we want to basically place ourselves is also very important. If we lift the poorest among the poor along with us, will also improve ourselves, is one kind of a logic. At the same time, the other also a possibility. So these are actually in front of a policy maker to decide which side we need to really stand with. All right. So if that is the case, this is a very nice way of looking at the social welfare function. Now, what are the implicit assumptions underlies our discussions of social welfare in that sense? Now, if you look into the details, utility of the individual is paramount. Only outcome of allocation or process affects utility. How to model production, consumption, and preference, or democracy, fairness, etc. is the question. Then, how can the value of religion that promotes sacrifice, life after death, welfare of God to be concluded, and does the theory of the theory reflect the values and ideals of its creation, that is Western values, Eastern values, etc., and or is it more general, etc. All kinds of questions in fact pop up when we when if we not actually consider, or if you try to neglect all kinds of this in that sense. Now, what is actually a summary observation which we can immediately derive from it? There are typically many Pareto efficient allocation in the social welfare diagram, or when we speak about social welfare map, or what you call dimension or vector space, you have many Pareto efficient allocation possible. All right. Now, out of that, which one we have to choose is also the concern which we can actually, look into. That is, we have already seen that in the contract curve of the Edgeworth kind, where any point in that sense is an efficient point. Now, the redistribution, how that is possible? Individually negotiate? No, there would be some sort of a policy which is third party. All right, it is not by default you do because of your religion. For example, in uh, Christianity, it talks that you have to love your neighbors like you. That is whatever you have, you give them also. That is what is actually the kind of message. In Islam, you have actually ideas of giving alms to the poor, and every moment of your life, whatever kind of wealth you acquire, a portion of that you have to give up for the needy. So, for example, 2.5% of your total wealth of every year you have to give up as AMS at least. So, this is a kind of a mandatory rule as AMS rule. All right. Now, this is there in the religious value. That is what the earlier slides talked about. Which value which we comply with. Similarly, you have other religion also talks about this charity and sympathy, empathy, not only sympathy, it is also talk about empathy, right? So in African community, if you look into the community ideal is Ubuntu, I am therefore, I mean, I because of we. So that kind of a, sentiments which works, people, advance from one point to the other. So which point which normally we take in the Paretian, different Pareto efficient equilibrium points. So that is also very, very, very important as far as this particular discussion is concerned, because distributive efficiency is also very important. When we that fairness of the distributive efficiency is also, so fairness of the Pareto efficiency is also very important. Now, why did we observe a unique competitive equilibrium in our partial equilibrium analysis on that sense? So we consider a fixed initial endowment of income, that is, demand was fixed for all goods in that sense. So assume initial endowment of a variable, the demand curve for each good shifts as income changes when varying the initial endowment. This is what is actually the idea of the earlier kind of the partial equilibrium, but that is also very unique in that sense. But it is very difficult to see that that kind of a principle would do much on the much on to speak the general attitude of an economy in that sense. So let me not go to the details of all that, and that we will, I think, discuss in the exchange model of the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. I feel otherwise the lecture would be a little bit longer. All right. So let me stop here, and thank you for listening this portion of welfare economics, especially the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. I'll be having the next lecture based on the exchange economy in the next lecture, that is maybe the sixth lecture.